So let's get started with the presentation. So I'll introduce you to Swahili first. Some of you might have a background already. Some of you might be learning about Swahili for the very first time. But yeah, Swahili, or Kiswahili, as we say in Swahili. In Swahili, every language starts with Ki. So Kiswahili. It's a Bantu language that's widely spoken in East Africa and beyond. So countries that speak Swahili, as you can see on the map, are such as Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and you can see a little bit of Mozambique, a little bit of Somalia, and a little bit of Zambia too. So Swahili has been growing, and we'll talk more about that as we move on. Today, Swahili has over 16 million native speakers and over 200 million second or foreign language speakers. Again, I'll expound on that as we move on. So Swahili is a lingua franca of East and Central Africa, and a lingua franca is a language that is adopted as a common language between speakers who otherwise speak different native languages. So East Africans speak a ton of different ethnic languages, hundreds of them. Like Kenya alone has over 40, Tanzania has over 60, so you can imagine the confusion if we didn't have a common language to share. Does anybody here speak a lingua franca from any other part of the world? No? Okay, great. So I'll be talking more about Swahili as a lingua franca. So let's talk a little bit about Bantu, because I said Swahili is a Bantu language, but what does Bantu really mean? So Bantu is a group of the Niger-Congo languages spoken in East, Central, and Southern Africa. As you can see, I'll explain this map a little bit. So Bantu is the largest language family in East Africa, meaning that most of the languages, like the 60 and the 40 that I mentioned in Kenya and Tanzania, they fall under the Bantu category. But there are all other categories as well, such as the Nilotic languages and the Cushitic or Afroasiatic languages. So looking at this map, you can see, I didn't remember to, oh, that's the pointer, okay. Yeah, so this area here is the Bantu area, and you can see that East Africa is already very much Bantu, although we have a little bit of the Nilotes here, and actually my community is from the Nilotic groups, but still the majority is Bantu going all the way south. So now that we say Swahili is a Bantu language, I wanted to mention some of those native Bantu languages, and then I'll explain how Swahili came to be. So some of the Bantu languages that are spoken in East Africa are such as Kilingala in DRC, Kirundi in Burundi, Kinyarwanda in Rwanda, and then Kiganda in Uganda. So you can also see the names of the countries kind of relate to the languages that are spoken there. Kinyankole also in Uganda. And in Kenya, we have the Kikuyu community. This is a picture of Kikuyu women in their traditional attire. And we also have Kigiriama, which is a coastal language, a Bantu language in Kenya. And these are Giriama men in their traditional attire as well. So they are coastal inhabitants. I'll explain a little bit further later about the contribution of these people's languages to Swahili. So we also have communities like Chaga and Kisukuma. So the people would be called Wachaga, and the language is Kichaga or Wasukuma and Kisukuma in Tanzania. And then, of course, we have Swahili, which is the unifying language. So now, we could just say Swahili is made up of Bantu and Arabic, and a little more, not just Arabic. So Swahili was born from interactions between coastal Bantu communities and Arab traders who came in from the Middle East. As a result, Swahili contains up to 35% of vocabulary from Arabic or Persian words. It also has borrowed from Portuguese, English, and German. And all that has a historical explanation to it. So this percentage, 35, might be debatable depending on depending on your sources. And also there are variations to Swahili such that some Swahili could contain more Arabic than others. I'll mention a little bit more of that later. Now let's look at the map here of how Swahili was born. I mentioned that it originated from interactions between Bantu-speaking Africans and Arab traders along the East African coast. So Oman is right here, Iran is right here, and other Middle Eastern countries are right here. And so in those early days, the 9th century, around there, the Omani people or the Omani Arabs did a lot of trading with East Africans along this coast. And a lot of those happened to be the Bantus that I mentioned earlier. And they, of course, intermarried. And Bantu interacted with Arabic, and that's how Swahili was born. And the history of that area is such that after the Omani Arabs established their sultanate here, at some time, around the 16th century, they were ousted by the Portuguese. So the Portuguese came in and took over this area, and some Portuguese comes into the language as well, but not a lot of it. But the area was ruled by the Portuguese for some time, after which they were ousted again by the Arabs again, and later by the colonial rule of Germany and Britain. Sorry. So Tanzania being taken over by Germany, and initially Germany taking over the entire region, and then the British taking over Kenya, and Germany taking over Tanzania. And those are the colonial rule are the ones that contributed to Swahili being standardized and also being pushed inward. So now from the coast, Swahili, having born around the coastal area, starts moving inward, because now it's needed as an official language, as a national language, especially during the colonial period, which in most of these countries ended in the 1960s, at the point which Swahili was already very well established and being used in a lot of, like in the media, in the government, and I'll talk about that a little more. So, yeah, so I mentioned that the German and British colonial powers facilitated its growth inward, and then Swahili became the language that unified people, so a national language, and now it's an official language in several East African countries. I want to show you a little bit about native, because we talked about native Swahili speakers and then second or foreign language Swahili speakers, which it can be a confusing way to classify, because I would identify as a second language speaker of Swahili, but really also as a native if you are to go by the languages that you grow up speaking from the time you are a baby. So then I would say I'm like a native Swahili speaker. But in another sense, native Swahili speakers are the people who are born out of that interaction between Bantu and Arabs, and so they're often of mixed ethnicity, and you'd find them, they're also I could say maybe more than 95% Muslim, if not 99%. I haven't really met a Swahili that's not a Muslim. So they would dress like that, sometimes with the black buibui, sometimes with lesso. This is called lesso, and they would just wrap themselves. And as you can see, the gentlemen also dress as Muslims would dress in any other part of the world. So, and they inhabit the coastal regions. To this date, of course, they stayed in the coastal areas mostly of Kenya and Tanzania, parts of Somalia and Mozambique. The Swahili they speak, so when I mentioned 35% earlier, the Swahili that these people speak is often more, it has more Arabic in it, and you can understand why, because they are Muslims. So because sometimes you have areas where there's a Bantu word for something, but there's also an Arabic word for something, they would most likely choose to use the Arabic vocabulary, while the people inland would choose to use the Bantu vocabulary for the same thing. So then you find their Swahili having a lot of Arabic that sometimes things would, skip me too. And an example, where we say hujambo si jambo, they would say assalamu alaikum, which is like a greeting used by Muslims. Please, by the way, if you have questions, maybe you could just hold them. I don't know, I feel like I'll let you jump in, but also I feel like I should let you hold your questions until the end. Yeah, let's do that. Okay, so now having talked about Swahili being born at the coast and then moving inward, so now let's talk about the role of Swahili in different East African countries, starting with Kenya. Swahili is an official language, so it's used in all government offices. It's a national language too, so it unifies all of the Kenyans. Like I mentioned, we have over 40 ethnic languages, so it is through Swahili that we, get to communicate with each other. And so I'm from Western Kenya. If I travel to Nairobi or like I went to school at the coast, Swahili is automatically the language we use more than English. I know English is also there, but Swahili is the language of daily communication. Swahili is taught in all public schools as a compulsory subject from kindergarten through high school. So you take English and Swahili all the way. And then English is the language of instruction for all other subjects and in Kenya. But in Tanzania, as you'll see, it's a bit different. In Tanzania, Swahili is also an official language. It's also a national language. And there's a little bit of difference in how Kenyans and Tanzanians use Swahili. Although Tanzanians belong to various ethnic groups too, just like with Kenya, many of them speak Swahili primarily. But in Kenya, if you come to the rural areas, people most likely use their native tongues. And they will only speak Swahili if the other person does not understand that native tongue. But in Tanzania, there's a bit of history with their president, Mwalimu Julius Nyerere of the past, who promoted Swahili really. To an extent, it sort of suppressed the native languages. Yeah. So Swahili is also taught in public schools in Tanzania as a compulsory subject from kindergarten to, through high school. And it is the language of instruction in primary education. So for all subjects, they teach in Swahili. But when kids get to high school, the language of instruction changes to English, and then Swahili is the only one that's taught in Swahili. There's a bit of complaints about this policy because sometimes it gets teachers unprepared or kids unprepared to switch from one language of instruction to the other. But I don't think I want to get into that too deeply. Looking at the role of Swahili in Uganda, so if you remember the map well, Tanzania and Kenya have, they have coasts, they touch the ocean. Uganda is a landlocked country. So the effects of Swahili in Uganda are a bit different from Kenya and Tanzania. So Uganda adopted Swahili as an official language only in 2022, as opposed to Kenya and Tanzania, who have had it for, since he was born. Before then, Swahili was taught as an optional language in schools, and Swahili was only used by the Ugandan army, but not by civilians. But plans are ongoing to make it compulsory in schools now. So they did not embrace Swahili as much as Kenya and Tanzania, and also there are some theories to explain why that is. But the most obvious one is that it's also landlocked, so it's a little bit farther from the birth of Swahili itself. Okay, so the role of Swahili in other East African countries, it's an official language in Rwanda. It's a national language in the DRC. The DRC just recently joined the East African community, and so Swahili is getting more embraced, of course. And it has no official status in Somalia and Burundi, but is spoken in some parts of those countries. But they have other primary languages in those countries. So now, as a way of a little bit of a break in between our presentation, I want to teach you some Swahili. So, there's this greeting in Swahili where you say shikamo, and the response is marahaba. Shikamo, marahaba. This is a formal greeting to someone who's much older than you. Like when you're saying hello to grandparents or your parents, then you would say shikamo. It's especially embraced in the coastal region. Like if you were to say a different greeting to people who are older, they would be offended. It would be like you're not respectful. So you have to use the respectful greeting of shikamo. Okay. But the more common greeting would be hujambo, sijambo. Hujambo, sijambo. That is a formal greeting to someone who's younger or a little older or same age as you. So If you've traveled to East Africa, you've had a version of it, jambo, just jambo, 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 but the whole thing is hujambo, si jambo. I keep clicking the wrong button on this clicker, sorry. And then, if it's greeting to many people, we say hamjambo, hatujambo. A formal greeting to several people, like whenever I walk into class, I say to my students, hamjambo, and they say hatujambo back to me. But if I'm speaking to one student, then I'll say hujambo, si jambo. And then there's also habari, habari gani, nzuri, like what's up, hello, hi. Habari gani, nzuri. This is a quite informal greeting to someone who's younger or a little older or same age as you. But, like I said, if you say habari gani to an older person, especially in the coastal regions, they would not be happy with you. And then there are colloquial greetings too. Vipi, niaje, sasa. Tanzanians like to say inakwendaje, or at least one of my Tanzanian friends like to say inakwendaje. And then you say freshi, au fiti, au poa. So those are informal greetings mostly used by the youth. So, Annie, hujambo? I don't know your friend's name, but Lila? Lila, habari gani? Good. All right. Christopher and Samahan and Tyra. Uh-huh. Hamjambo. Uh-huh. Ndio. Yeah. Hamjambo. Aha, sawa sawa. Vizuri kabisa. Okay, to all of you, hamjambo. Aha, hamjambo. Poa, awesome students. Okay. Jina langu ni Magdalyne. Mimi ninatoka Kenya. Jina langu ni Magdalyne. Mimi ninatoka Kenya. Jina lako ni nani? Unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Annie, ninatoka Marekani.
Aha, sawa. Amesema tena?
Jina langu ni Annie, mimi ninatoka Marekani.
Vizuri sana. Poa. I will not pick on people that I know are meeting this for the first time, but I'm gonna go with my colleague who just arrived. His name is Marco. Karibu sana mwalimu. Aha. Haya, jina lako ni nani na wewe unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Marco. Mimi ninatoka Tanzania.
Vizuri sana. Haya. Christopher, I'm coming to you. Jina lako ni nani? Wewe unatoka wapi? And just so to prepare you, the United States is Marekani. Can we all say Marekani?
Marekani.
Sawa, Christo. Okay. Wewe jina lako ni nani? Wewe unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Christopher. Mimi ninatoka Marekani.
Vizuri sana. Asante, asante. Na wewe je, jina lako ni nani? Unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Tyra, ninatoka
Marekani. Asante sana. Aha. Na wewe je, jina lako ni nani? Unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Chimwe, nimetoka Marekani.
Vizuri sana. Asante. I hope you don't mind me picking on you too, sir. Jina lako ni nani? Wewe unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Patrick, ninatoka Marekani.
Asante, Marekani. Marekani, asante. Na wewe je, jina lako ni nani? Wewe unatoka wapi?
Jina langu ni Sarah, mimi ninatoka Marekani.
Asante sana. Vizuri. Rafiki yangu huko mwisho. Hujambo?
Jambo, jina langu ni Rehema, ninatoka Tanzania.
Asante. Karibuni sana. And just like that, now you can say you speak Swahili. Sawa sawa. Haya, more basic words and phrases in Swahili. Asante, karibu, pole pole. Maybe I'm speaking too fast and you want to say pole pole, tafadhali, pole pole. Au ndio, hapana. Nimefurahi kukufahamu. Unatoka wapi? This one always gives our students trouble. You know, it's a mouthful. Nimefurahi kukufahamu. Nice to meet you. So I'm not going to ask you to remember those, but I have a task for you. In pairs, greet each other and introduce yourselves to each other in Swahili. So I taught a lot of greetings. You can pick whichever you remember, and then introduce yourself in Swahili as well. And I'm just going to go back to the greeting slide. If you want me to skip on, I can also skip on to this slide. Just 1 minute. Say hello to the person seated next to you and introduce yourself to them. Tell them where you come from, and also ask them the same thing. Please speak to, yes. Awesome. All right, let's get back. Thank you. See, that was an opportunity to practice some Swahili. Do we have any pair that would like to tell us what they did? One pair that would like to present to the class? Volunteers. I'll not pick on you. No? You want to do it? Sawa. Sawa. Loudly. Okay, let's clap for them. Asanteni sana, Ani na Lila. Sawa. So a few more fun facts about Swahili. So as you can see, it's written in Latin alphabet, and it has no grammatical gender. In Swahili, there's no he or she. It's just one thing that you say for both males and females and, all genders. It's also simple pronunciation. It's said as it is written, just like Spanish. And so I think that makes it easy to learn, but some people may disagree. I don't know. But what did you think so far? Did you think it was easy to speak it, or do you think it's quite easy, right? Yeah. Okay, so just to recap on the first section that I talked about, so Swahili has both native and non-native speakers, but that terminology has to be used quite carefully, or I would say it can be confusing. Yeah, like I'm not a native Swahili speaker in that I wasn't born of the, of the ethnicity that's a mixed ethnicity, but I've been speaking Swahili since I was born. I've been learning it in school. In that essence, I am a native-like, yeah, but not in ethnicity. It's a language of unity across different ethnic groups, so it's a lingua franca. It's a symbol of African pride and cultural identity too. Swahili is currently being embraced more and more as a language of doing different kinds of business in East Africa and even beyond Africa. But yeah, I would just say generally that it forms an identity for a lot of people. It's used in trade, education, religion, and also diplomacy, and that's part of the reason why it's taught here in the United States. It's also promoted as a language of Pan-Africanism, started by Mwalimu Julius Nyerere back then. It's used in government and media. I know this is kind of repetitive, but I just wanted to point out that, for example, in Kenya and Tanzania, parliamentary sessions can take place in either Kiswahili or in English, and also in both countries, news broadcasts happen more in Swahili than in English, especially if you listen to the radio in Kenya or Tanzania. It's mostly going to be in Swahili, although we also have local language news stations and English news, of course, but Swahili seems to be the stronger language. Let's talk a little bit about the influence of other cultures on Swahili and East Africa, because at the beginning I mentioned that it is a language that has borrowed from Arabic, from Persian, from German, English, Portuguese. So from Arabic, Swahili has mostly borrowed vocabulary, but also clothing, jewelry, cuisine, and the Islamic lifestyle in general. And the Arabic influence is much heavier in the coastal regions where Islam is also most widely practiced. And from India, Swahili has borrowed a lot from the, I would say, from the Indian subcontinent, I would say, and especially with food. A lot of cuisine that's made by Swahili people is of Indian origin, like pilau, biryani, the kebabs, chapati, chai, etc., but also clothing and henna. Along the coast, women would do a lot of henna on their body, especially if there's a wedding or some special occasions. But it's not just, these dishes are not just made in the coastal regions. No, these are dishes that are eaten throughout East Africa. And then European influences are mostly in terms of language, like the loanwords, and then the education system. Of course, we went through an education system that was put in place by Britain, and it's in place to this date. Words like computer or baiskeli, aushati, blausi, all those are Swahili words, but you can tell where they came from. And then some words are from the Portuguese language too. Mesa is a Portuguese word. When I learned that, I was quite shocked, like, oh, okay. Padre, gereza for prison, it's very close to the Portuguese word. And then pesa, like pesos. Yeah, so, and many more, I just picked a few. Now, I mentioned clothing, so that's how I would say the Swahili people of the ethnic group would wear like that, because they are also Muslims. And then for the foods that I mentioned, I do have a few pictures here. This is chicken pilau, so it's just like a one-pot dish of rice and chicken. It could also be beef, it could be any meat. And this is ugali. Well, I would say, so this dish, of course, has an origin in the Middle East and Southeast Asia, and also the samosas and the chapati. But for ugali, I would say this is more of, let me not explain the history, but I would just say this is not really like part of these dishes. This is more, it has its own different history, but it's the staple of East Africa, ugali and some stew, some mostly meat stew and some greens, leafy greens. That's our staple food in East Africa. But whenever you mention pilau, samosa, and chapati, well, chapati is also all through the region, but especially with pilau, people think of the coast where the Swahili people inhabit. But Swahili is not just spoken in East Africa. It is now, I mean, we are here speaking about Swahili, so that's one example. So there's Swahili beyond East Africa. And in the United States, I think the most popular way Swahili has, come into the United States is through the movie The Lion King, and words like Hakuna Matata, Simba, the main character, or Rafiki, and many other characters. In the very recent release of Lion King, or Mufasa, there was a word say milele. There was a place called milele, which means forever. That's also a Swahili word. Swahili is also used in music, literature, and academic studies worldwide. People write their dissertations in the language, of course. People write a lot of academic research. And Swahili music and literature, both like published novels, is very rich. Poetry is even richer. But we'll get to that another time. Swahili today, the language of Africa and beyond. So Swahili is now taught in other African countries outside of East Africa, like South Africa and Ghana do offer Swahili in some of their colleges. Swahili outside of Africa, such as in the United States, Germany, Poland, and China. I've seen a lot of research on Swahili, a lot of publications from Germany and Poland. I mean, leaving out the United States, which might be, I don't know which might be leading, but Germany might be actually leading because we have dictionaries, Swahili dictionaries, which are called kamusi, that have been published by people in Germany. So, but the US, Germany, and Poland, I know for sure, have a really strong, they do a lot of work on Swahili, but China is also upcoming. Its growing presence in the US is especially notable due to African immigrants like ourselves, and the university programs like the one I teach in. Study abroad programs for American students to East Africa are also common and ongoing. Like I mentioned, Annie and I went to Kenya on a study abroad program in 2022, and we were there for 8 weeks. And we visited the capital city, Nairobi, and then we went to the coast, to Pwani University. And people go, and a lot of students go to Tanzania too. Many more go to Tanzania for study abroad. And when they come back, they speak nice, clean Swahili, just like Annie. Yeah. And also, there's a World Kiswahili Day now. It was established on July 7th, 2022. And it's, that was the first time it was celebrated. It found us in Pwani when it was celebrated first. Yeah, and July 7th is an important date in Tanzania. Sabasaba, and it was when the president of that time, Julius Nyerere, adopted Swahili as the language that unifies the people of the country. And so Sabasaba is a day that is still celebrated to this day. Sabasaba meaning 7/7. And so the day today is, every July 7th we celebrate and acknowledge Swahili and its continuing growth in the world. Let me see. This link here is just an article on that. It was published by the UN. So if you get a hold of these slides and you want to read the article, you're welcome to. Okay, so there's also a global association for the promotion of Swahili. In Swahili, we say Chama cha Ukuzaji wa Kiswahili Duniani. And that is an association for all Swahili scholars and people who love Swahili. All the teachers of Swahili here in the United States are members of that. A lot of teachers are members of that association. And we hold annual academic conferences across the world to promote research in Swahili and about Swahili. And these conferences have, for example, we've gone to Uganda, people have gone to Tanzania, people have come here to the United States, and I think this year it's happening in Havana, Cuba. And after that, maybe it will be Poland. Like, they just try to meet in all areas where Swahili is embraced. And that's the website for Chaukidu if you want to learn more about the association. Maybe you want to learn a little bit more Swahili after today's talk. So we have language apps that offer Swahili lessons like Duolingo, Memrise, Mango Languages, and Pimsleur. So yeah, Duolingo is the most popular one, I think. So you can learn Swahili on Duolingo. You can also read Swahili children's books and listen to Swahili music. It's a very rich category, like I mentioned. You can find this music on YouTube and you can listen to it. And for children's books, you can buy them on Amazon, or if you happen to travel to East Africa, you can buy a whole bunch of them. They're very affordable, like $2, $3 per book. It's a nice way usually to, if you're a beginning learner of Swahili. You could also watch Swahili lessons on YouTube by various instructors. We have, YouTube has all sorts of videos. And you can find like beginner level Swahili as well as advanced Swahili. You can also engage with the Swahili speaking communities online or locally. Like here in Ann Arbor, today is March 15th. On March 28th, we do have an event on campus where our students, but not just the Swahili students, but also the Yoruba students from, Yoruba is a language spoken in Nigeria. Our students will be getting together to celebrate the Africa Day. And They will be dancing on, dancing to African music. They'll be clothed in some African attire, and we hope to share some African food. Most likely, it will be from Nigeria, but that's only because we don't have a Swahili restaurant yet in Ann Arbor. If we had one, we would have them cater for the event. But yeah, it's an open event. If you want to come in, you're welcome, but you would have to reach out maybe so I can share the details of where the event is happening and the time. But it's basically myself and my colleague Marco. Mwalimu Marco, can you wave again? We are the teachers of Swahili in the university in DAS, and we have a colleague who teaches Yoruba, and we are hosting that event together with our department, of course, and the African Studies Center, and our students. Yeah, so if you want to learn more about Swahili's history and structure, which is just a summary of all the information that I've talked about, you can watch this video on YouTube. Somebody has done a good job of summarizing, like the birth of Swahili from the time the Arabs came, when the Portuguese came, and also a little bit about the structure of the language. I am very happy that I'm done at 1:42 p.m., which I think is a good time. But yeah, that is the end. Asanteni sana. Yeah. So now I welcome questions, comments, just thoughts, anything that someone wants to say. Yeah.
Well, Magdalyne, I always have lots of questions about language. One thing I was curious about is are the noun categories. Could you say just a few words about that?
Oh.
People who haven't studied languages with noun categories may not be familiar with that.
Right.
And you introduced your talk by talking about Kiswahili and why languages all have that same prefix.
Thank you. Yeah, that is usually one of the things that our students really point out as an issue in learning Swahili, but I don't want to say that it's difficult. So Swahili has noun classes. So I mentioned that it doesn't have gender, which is a good thing. You don't have to remember he or she, but it has noun classes which influence how you formulate your sentence. So the noun classes can be categorized both in terms of semantics, so meanings of the words, as well as their morphology. So the noun classes can be categorized up to 18, but depending on, so some different sources categorize them a little bit differently, but for sure the first 10 classes are very certain and well defined, and then from 11 to 18 things get a little bit murky. So let's say I'm talking about humans, sister, brother, mother, or even titles like professor. As long as you're talking about humans, you place them in one noun class, and there's a way you're going to say them. There's a way you're going to say a verb. I wish I had added a slide here, but unfortunately I did not. I would say mwalimu anafundisha, for the teacher is teaching. But I wouldn't say the same thing if I was talking about an unhuman object. Or let's say someone fell down. I would say mtoto ameanguka, the kid has fallen down. But if I wanted to say the pen fell down, it would be kalamu imeanguka. So there are changes that happen. Let's say there are subject markers, and those subject markers change depending on the noun class. And since there are so many noun classes, you have to kind of work your mind actively to know that if I'm talking about a pen versus a bicycle versus a book, I have to know how to conjugate the verb, also the adjective, also the possessive marker. A lot of things change in the sentence just because of the noun. So depending on the noun you're using in the sentence, it's going to determine how you form your sentence. I mean, you can make a mistake and not be correct in how you say your sentence. You would still be understood, but the grammar police will attack you. But you would still be understood in most cases. If I wanted to say a small child versus a small table versus a small building, all those would have different affixes because all those are different nouns falling in different noun classes. Should I stop there?
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah. I really wish I had a slide, but I did not. but it's stuff you can find online. If you just Google Swahili noun classes, ooh, you would have a lot of information. And yeah, you could learn more about them. Thank you, Christopher. Any other question or comment, or just something new that you learned today that you maybe are excited about, or not really excited, but like, you know.
I was also curious about the Hindi influence in Swahili. So there's no past of colonization, right? It's just because the Indian subcontinent is relatively close-ish, or is that right?
Actually, there is part of it that's about colonization. So the history says that when the British came in to colonize, for example, Kenya, they brought a lot of Indian people to build the railway. The railway was starting from the coast, going all the way through Kenya to Uganda, and they brought a lot of Indian people to build that. And those people came with their culture, and they became residents of East Africa. And by the way, to this date, we have a substantial Indian population, or let me say, they're East African now, but they are of Indian descent. And so since they stayed and they came with their culture, it got embraced. I think the food was awesome, so it got really popular because it is the most popular food, you know, compared to, there are not many Western dishes, I would say, in East Africa, but the Indian food really is the food of East Africa, to the extent that every time like an Indian person from India sees food that's East Africa, they're like, oh, actually that's also our food, and we call it the exact same thing. So yeah, it has a history in colonization, but it's like the Indian people were brought in. Maybe some of it is also because of Indian people coming in, you know, on their own for trade, but the being brought in to build the railway is the most acknowledged way.
I see.
Yeah.
Thanks. Do we have any other questions today? Yes, please.
Okay, Annie.
Thank you. So I'm just curious, you mentioned that there isn't any Swahili food like in Ann Arbor. Are there Swahili communities in Michigan or other places to get Swahili food, like Detroit or Lansing or other places?
Good question. Honestly, that's a question that I need to probably, especially about the food, it's something I need to research on more seriously. But I just know when I was in East Lansing as a student, there was no Swahili. You know, you'd hear that there was one and then it closed. So yeah, up to this point, I cannot say for sure that there's one in, probably there's one in Detroit, but it's not just Swahili. It's something that touches on Somali food, and you know, when it comes to food, Somali food might be a little bit like the Kenyan and Tanzanian food, but like Ethiopian food is really removed. So when you hear there's East African food, but it's an Ethiopian restaurant, it's very different from the East African food. Yeah, so I cannot say there's one that I know in Michigan, but when I was in Ohio, there was one in Columbus, which was Kenyan, and they would really make fish, like the whole tilapia and all the chapatis and ugali. So that was a Kenyan restaurant in Ohio, Columbus. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions? Yeah. Here,
they
let me
do?
bring the mic
Yeah.
over to you.
I think as you get there, about the communities, though, we do have communities of Swahili speakers. Just one quick moment. So like when I was in East Lansing, we had this group of, it was called the Association of Kenyans in Lansing, and all the, you know, when new students would come in from East Africa to join programs at Michigan State, they would be welcomed and they would feel at home. And we would meet, like when there's a Kenyan holiday on the other side, we would also celebrate it here, just get together and share a meal. So those kind of communities. When we moved to Ann Arbor, there's another community. It's called Wima. No, maybe Wima is Wakenya in Michigan, but there's another one where we were with Tanzanians, and it was more like East African community. Maybe it's the same thing. Maybe it's the same Wima, another community of Kenyans, but we tend to meet like beyond Kenya, like more like East African, Swahili speakers mostly. And then here in Anaba, it's just the few of us, Kenyans, Tanzanians, and a few people from Rwanda, maybe Burundi, Uganda. We also meet every once in a while, but it's not like an established association or anything. Yeah. Thank you. Now back to you.
No, back to the food question. Your ugali, what is that made out of, and is that similar to fufu in West Africa?
Good question. It's like they are cousins. So ugali, the one ugali that I showed, let me just use my clicker. Ugali, this one's made of corn flour. So it's basically you boil water and you add corn flour and you start to make a thick porridge. And I know that for fufu, it can be yam. And there's also gari, which is like a cassava flour. So we don't use yam in East Africa, but we use cassava, but a little differently. And the resulting ugali is brown. Yeah, and it tastes plain. Ugali is plain, so you have to eat it with a stew and some vegetables to give it taste. Yeah, but they're very close, and they're eaten the same way with your hands. It's the same exact thing. Yeah. Thank you for that question. I think it's 1:52. I have 8 minutes to spare, but I don't know.
Let's thank Magdalyne.
Thank you.